As I watched the film over the weekend, I took note of the fact that when Dylann Roof was arrested, there were several police officers, and the police officer that approached the door of the automobile he was driving, he reholstered his gun. He didn't point it. He reholstered his gun. There was tremendous difference in his arrest and what we've seen in the last several days.
That was Congressman Jim Clyburn on the differences between how the two officers handled the attempted arrest of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta and the arrest of white supremacist Dylann Roof, who killed 9 people inside of a Charleston church almost 5 years ago. Let's bring right now Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. He's a member of both the Foreign Relations and Judiciary Committees. Senator Booker is also the co-sponsor of the Justice and Policing Act, proposed last week, and also introduced legislation to remove Confederate statues from the Capitol. Senator, always great to talk to. You know, just sitting there listening to Jim Clyburn, one thing's obvious, that we can pass all the reforms we want. You have some great legislation right there that goes to procedures and reforms inside police departments and policing across America. But we have a cultural problem here on how white suspects are treated differently from black suspects. How do we bridge that gap?
Well, again, you know, King said it so eloquently, I can't pass legislation to make you love me, but I can pass legislation to stop you from lynching me. And so, look, we've seen lots of reforms passed. You've watched this from the Kerner report all the way to Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing. There are actually things we could have done and implemented as federal law that would have saved Breonna Taylor from being killed. And if she was killed, those officers would have been brought to justice. They haven't even been arrested yet. There are things that could have been done that could have saved Eric Garner, banning chokeholds. That we just are not doing the things we know will either save lives or those officers that violate our clearly articulated federal standards will be held accountable in a court of law. So I'm not one of these folks that believes that we're powerless. We're not. What we are is lacking courage and evidencing a political cowardice and not doing the things that, mark my words, will get done one day. There are practices in this country that one day we will look back and say are archaic. But right now, in this moment, the question is will we step up and do what we know will save lives in America?
Willie.
Senator Booker, Willie, guys, good to see you this morning. I want to ask you about qualified immunity, something you've been speaking about quite a bit in the last couple of weeks, which effectively protects individual police officers from civil actions by complainants. So do you see this as something that can be overturned from the federal level? We've heard a lot from Republicans that say these are state and local issues, all of these police reform ideas, or most of them anyway. What about qualified immunity? Something that even Clarence Thomas, obviously a conservative justice on the Supreme Court, says should be looked at.
Yeah, this is the weird positioning, and I'm going to call it out in the hearing today, that somehow this is a right versus left thing. That's just wrong. From Clarence Thomas to George Bush's, the father's first address to Congress, calling out racial and religious profiling. On qualified immunity, I was just looking at a document from the Cato Institute listing a whole bunch of other conservative organizations that all think it's outrageous that we are a country where you can violate another person's civil rights and you cannot be held accountable through a 1983 civil rights claim. It's unconscionable to me. And the stories of failed attempts in civil court to sue somebody, shields of qualified immunity, are stunning. A pregnant woman in Washington, 7 months pregnant, dragged out into the streets by police, tased 3 times, shielded by qualified immunity. A man in a Utah hospital suffering from pneumonia, delirious, just stumbling around, unarmed, shot and killed by police. They were shielded from being sued by qualified immunity. I could go through these cases that are heartbreaking and painful, and the thought that we don't have the ability to hold those officers accountable on the federal level, either through qualified immunity on the civil side or Section 242, which has been a shield on the criminal side, is unconscionable. And let me just say this. If there is no accountability, there will be no change. If officers know they can do things that are so far against our community standards, but know they won't face criminal or civil penalties, there will be no change.
So, Senator, you come at this not from a theoretical point of view, all of this, because you were the mayor of Newark, New Jersey. You've had to deal on the ground, unlike many senators that you serve with, on a police level, on a community level. And you have to look at these things very specifically and look at the impacts inside the community as a mayor. So what have you brought, do you think, to the debate that you've shared with other senators about the complexities of the conversations that we're having right now?
Yeah, look, I know police officers. I've virtually lived with them for years of my life. I know some of the great police officers I've worked with would talk to me about people using force and being so quote unquote justified in the use of force, but still dead wrong in using deadly force because they were not trained well, because they didn't show the kind of restraint or ability to deconflict a situation. And so one of the best lessons I learned the hard way as mayor of the city of Newark, where I was an African-American mayor of a majority black city with a majority black city council with a black police chief, is that so much of this is baked in endemic systematic racism, and you have to go further to create accountability. And one of the fundamental things that you need to have accountability is a sunshine on the data, on the actual patterns and practices of a police department, which we do not have in the United States of America. It took the Department of Justice coming into my police department, using, frankly, resources that we didn't have to really analyze the data and demonstrate to us a lot of our practices and how they were wrong. And so this is not about good intentions. This is not about a few bad apples. This is about a system of policing in our country that has gone way off the rails, and unless we begin to mandate certain things, reporting of use of force, reporting of misconduct, reporting of racial data, of stops and more, then we're not going to get truly at this. We're going to be nibbling across the edges. And what I'm worried about now is that people are going to try to do some kind of diluted lowest common denominator reforms and try to say that taking your knee halfway off somebody's neck should be celebrated as somehow justice. And we're going to find ourselves, if we don't do the real reforms, back here again after another spate of killings by police have been captured on videotape, and we realize we didn't do everything we could do and should do that we knew would be able to stop this problem.
Senator, it's Katty Kay here. Since this is a systemic issue and everything should be on the table, I wanted to ask you about police being armed. It's a big difference from other countries, obviously, but last year in the States, we don't have perfect data, but 458 people were killed by police. In Germany, it was 8. In Britain, it was 0, and in Japan, it was 0. And one of the big differences, of course, is that police in those countries are not armed. Not all police carry arms in those countries. Is there any conversation to be had, given how many arms there are in society in the States, about whether police should be carrying weapons, whether all police should be carrying weapons at all times?
Right, and so some of that, let's just give balance. Some of that obviously is, we are a nation where the guns have proliferated, where police officers who do approach cars don't know if that person is armed or not. But when you look at the police use of force, it doesn't accommodate for that massive disparity. It's because, as was said by Clyburn beforehand, as a man who's had guns pointed at me, we have police officers that are unholstering their weapons, creating tension and challenges. Think of the deaths of what we've seen on videotape recently that are unnecessary. And so this is the point. I've seen this again in a community where you do have, in every community, people with mental health challenges, serious mental illnesses, like schizophrenia, how sometimes even autism can manifest itself by appearance of violent intent. But if you have police who are not trained at the scene, those could escalate and end deadly. If you have people, and there's pilot studies that have shown this in America, that actually bring mental health professionals who are familiar with these types of mental illnesses that can deconflict a situation. It can be handled at lower taxpayer costs that affirm human dignity and elevate the sanctity of human life. And that's the real larger issue. The bill that Kamala and I and others have written is about policing. It's narrowly tailored to create accountability. But the larger frame of this in America has to be that all the problems of society cannot be addressed with police and prisons. We have over-criminalized everything from poverty to sexual trauma to mental illness to addiction. We've got to stop that. We can all imagine a more beloved community where people that are hurting or hurt, people that are fragile, people that are sick and have healthcare issues, that we address those within that context and not a policing one. When we get to that point and begin to empower fragile folks in fragile circumstances, we will see our need for police dissolve and have a very light kind of police force compared to what we have right now. Unfortunately, as you compared us to other nations, we have a country right now that is only 5% of the planet's population. But we have so criminalized this country that we have 1 out of every 4 incarcerated people on the planet Earth in our prisons and jails, where we do things in prison and jail to further harm, hurt, and traumatize them, put them on the streets with even less ability to economically sustain their families or address their fragility. And we end up with cycles of recidivism, destroyed lives, destroyed families, destroyed communities.
All right, Senator Cory Booker, as always, thank you so much for being with us. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, coming up next, we're going to be talking to an infectious disease expert about the spike in the coronavirus cases and whether he's concerned about the virus spreading at large gatherings like the protests or the president's upcoming rally. Dr. Michael Osterholm is our next guest. We're looking forward to talking to him next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.